with Michael Parker on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, folks, this is the final hour of the show today here on Deprogram. I will be joined in just a moment by Tim Keyes. He is an author, a biblical historian, a researcher, and we will talk about his project, God Save the Queen. This is TNT. We'll be right back.
Delivering the facts.
The source I can trust.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, folks, this is the last segment of Deprogram today, and we're going to be joined by Tim Keyes. Tim is a person that I've had the pleasure of working with on several projects, and we're going to talk about his primary project and platform, which is called God Save the King. Tim is an author, he's a lecturer, he's a researcher. I've learned a lot from Tim. He can currently be found with his radio show, God Save the King, on Truth Be Told Radio Network, and he can also be found on the internet with his website, godsavetheking.org. Tim, greetings. How are you?
I'm great, Michael. Really good to be on with you today.
Well, I'm glad you're able to be able to take time and join me. So let's jump right into this. Now, you have done a huge amount of work, and so we're going to have to kind of paint in broad strokes today. But first of all, just tell us what God Save the King is, and then we're going to get deeper into the points that you make about it.
Of course. Yeah, God Save the King, very simply, is my over 30-year research project into the nativity of Jesus Christ. And the quick, summary statement is that the traditional nativity story that we are all familiar with, it's got a few problems here and there. And therefore, my project is devoted to correcting these common misconceptions about the nativity story and retelling it the way it really would have happened.
And let's cut straight to the chase here. One of the points that you're making, and probably the most startling to some people. Now, some people may have heard this, but just to get it right out there, you are stating that Jesus Christ was not born on December 25th. How would you know that? And we won't give the correct date right away, but how would you know that is not the case? And why would it matter?
Well, it's wow. I mean, we could spend the entire hour on that one question, but obviously
Sure.
We don't have that kind of time. The number one, we're assuming that date is correct. But when you stop and back up for a second and say, well, let's examine that date. And you look at the evidence that is supposed to tell us that he was born on December 25th. There isn't any. It's really just that simple. If you were in a court of law and asked, okay, what's your evidence? You'd be pretty darn empty-handed. So that's the part of the reason we know that it's not December 25th. I do have a theory behind why they came up with that date, why they came up with a late December date, which is very simply, you have two infancy narratives in the Bible. You've got one in Matthew and you've got one in Luke. The one in Luke concerns itself primarily with the birth of Christ. The one in Matthew concerns itself primarily with the arrival of the Magi about 15 months after Jesus was born. But when you take a close look at these two, records, in the record in Luke, where that's the record where the shepherds show up and find the baby in a manger, it says very clearly that while they tried to quote unquote tell everybody, there was no big public response. Okay. But when the Magi arrived, it says that not only was King Herod troubled, but all Jerusalem with him. In other words, it made a big stir, and we're kind of giving it away a little bit here, but late December is when the Magi arrived at Herod's court. See, so it actually makes sense that they would assume a late December birth date because of the public commotion.
So we'll back up just a little bit, because some people may wonder exactly what we're talking about. And what Tim is trying to express here and why it's important is, first of all, we are saying that Jesus Christ was a historical character and existed in a period of time in which there were various governments in various countries competing for turf and power, just like as we are today. And the story that you think you know in the traditional Christmas lore that we see on television and in Christmas cards does not accurately define what actually happened. So why does this matter? Well, the truth matters and history matters. Tim, in the segment before you came on, I had a therapist on and we were talking about the power of dreams. Since you mentioned the Magi, let's just start point by like clearing up some misconceptions. Who were the Magi?
Okay, well, the Magi were a combination religious and political official in the Parthian Empire. And that's another part of the story that many people are not very familiar with. The Parthian Empire is the superpower that is to the east of the Bible lands, the east of Judea, or Israel, as we would call it today. Pretty much everybody's aware of Rome. That's the superpower to the west, but Parthia is the superpower to the east. And in their government, they had what was almost a parliamentary structure where they had an upper house and a lower house. The upper house was the royals, and then the lower house was the House of Magistanes, the Magi, and they fulfilled a dual religious and political role in their government.
And tell us what they did.
Okay, so they had a wide variety of responsibilities, including, teaching the royal family's children and things like that. They also would give a daily intelligence briefing to the king, whatever the king needed to know in order to make his decisions and declarations for the day or the week. It was the Magi that were his consultants, right? And they also, and to do that, to provide that information to the king, they interpreted dreams, which was considered a really big deal back then, especially for royalty and nobility. And they also consulted the stars.
For the audience, I've worked with Tim on a television production of this. And at the time, we were telling people it was like a real life Game of Thrones. And the reason that we say this is, as Tim lays out this information in our remaining hour, what you're going to find out is like, listen, things back then are very similar to the way things are now. There are governments, there are powers, there are states that don't get along with each other. We're all jockeying for power. And within that, there is our protagonist, Jesus Christ, and his family as actual historical figures. Now, so the point here is that Tim has a story to tell you that is going to elaborate how this all happened. So first of all, let's back up even more because we're going to return to the Magi and how they showed up. So Jesus Christ was born to Mary. Her betrothed was Joseph. Now, what's the backstory on them?
Well, the backstory on them now, one of the to dive right into it here, there is when you look at the traditional nativity story, the traditional nativity story can actually be tracked back to some apocryphal documents that I believe are really truly full of errors. Okay, so what we need to do is to reconstruct biblically and historically who Joseph and Mary really were, as opposed to, once again, what the traditional story tries to tell us. And one of the things that happened is that the nation of Israel, or the kingdom of Judea, had been dominated by foreign powers for so long, right, that it was not very big. And it went through a period of independence from about the middle of the 2nd century to about the middle of the 1st century BC, where it was actually an independent nation again for about 100 years. And during that period of independence, it started out tiny and it tried to expand to what they believed was their appropriate, land grant that was given them by God as part of the Abrahamic covenant all the way back in the book of Genesis. So they were annexing and frankly conquering new land and things like that. And one of the things they did is they deliberately migrated devout Jews into parts of the country that lacked this religious foundation that they were seeking for the entire country. So that is why you find Judeans. Joseph and Mary were Judeans. That's why you find Judeans living in Galilee, because Judea traditionally is southern Israel. And if they were following their land grant, well, then that's where they would live. But there was a very deliberate attempt to re-Judaize the north. So it is most likely that Joseph and Mary's families migrated to Galilee right around the turn of the century, from the 2nd century to the 1st century BC.
And they are depicted as being of modest means and just modest people. Is that true, though?
That's essentially correct, but with some added details, because yes, they would have lived in a small village, the village of Nazareth in Galilee. It would have been an agricultural village. However, another little bit of a misconception here. We are often told that Jesus was a carpenter and that he learned his trade from his adopted father, Joseph, who was also a carpenter. But in Greek, it's the word tekton. It's not the word for a carpenter. It's the word for a builder. And therefore, he would have been skilled not just in like making furniture and things like that, which is the way it's often portrayed, but he would have been skilled, frankly, in building homes. And he was a contractor,
or he was like a contractor.
Yeah. Bingo, exactly. He would have been, and ironically, wood was one of the least common building materials in Israel. The most common building material was stone. And go figure, when you look at all of the parables and stories that Jesus told, for someone who was supposed to have been a carpenter, he never used a woodworking metaphor once. And yet he used stone building metaphors several times. So he was a builder.
So, okay. And he came from a family of builders, but also the family lineage of both of them had significance.
Of course, yeah. So there's the builder component, because that means that although they would have suffered under confiscatory taxes from Herod the Great, that meant he wouldn't have been wealthy, but he would have been upper middle class. He would have made real money. Okay, Joseph would have, that is, right? And especially because the Roman town of Sepphoris was about 4 miles away. It was literally a city on a hill overlooking Nazareth, and they would have made plenty of money there. But also, they were not only of the tribe of Judah, but they were of the house of David, which means they were royals. Okay, they were of the royal line, which means this wouldn't have been some little fly-by-night matter-of-fact thing to them. They would have focused in on their lineage and the fact that they were devout and that they were awaiting this coming Messiah who was supposed to come from their tribe and their house.
And so she is now pregnant, and they are going to have to make this famous trip that has been depicted as her being pregnant and on the donkey. And talk about that, the truth of what really happened about how they got where they were going.
Of course. Well, it's traditionally, here you go again. Traditionally, it's depicted that she rode on the back of a donkey when she was very pregnant, literally about to give birth. Some productions even have her being in labor on the back of the donkey, which is frankly patently ridiculous, not to mention the fact that there's no donkey mentioned in the scriptural record. So that's an assumption. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but it is an assumption. But when you really dig into the story, her being pregnant and being publicly discovered would have been scandalous. So I have come to the conclusion, for a variety of reasons, that she determined to leave Nazareth pretty much immediately upon realizing that she was pregnant. She took frankly a reconnaissance mission to Judea for about 3 months to visit her relative Elizabeth, and also to, gather intelligence and figure out, okay, can I do this? Can I move to Judea, et cetera, et cetera? And then she goes back to Nazareth, where she and Joseph finalized their marriage. And I believe they discussed leaving Nazareth and that they were actually moving to Bethlehem, not just going there for a casual trip.
All right, you guys, we're going to take a quick break. I'm speaking with Tim Kise. He is the creator of the research project, God Save the King. We're talking about the nativity story and what he believes the historical accuracy of this was and why this is important. You are listening to TNT. This is Deprogram. My name is Michael Parker. We'll be right back.
Telling the truth is the only mandate we believe in. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Hey friends, when we left, we were talking about the fact that Joseph and Mary are considering leaving and moving to Bethlehem because, frankly, they've got an unwed pregnancy on their hand, which is a scandalous thing in that time period. So they're going to look at moving. So Tim, take it from there and give us the details further.
Okay, so part of what we're implying by that statement is the fact that they left Nazareth much earlier in Mary's pregnancy than we typically consider. The tradition is always that she's very pregnant. I believe she was no more than about 4 months pregnant, and therefore it totally rearranges this equation of how did they get there. I mean, the reality is that they probably rode in a cart, regardless of the other details, but they might have just walked. And ironically, at 4 months, maybe she did ride on the back of a donkey, which is kind of interesting because she could have actually done it then, as opposed to at 8 or 9 months, when that would be very difficult, especially given which route they took and the fact that the roads were not necessarily flat and straight. And then additionally, there's this, the way it seems to read, that's the key. The way it seems to read in Scripture is that they were required to travel to Bethlehem and register there because it was their ancestral hometown, when the reality of it is that statement is telling us that they were moving because you did not register where you didn't live. If it had simply been a matter of them registering, the Romans, and Herod would have used the Roman model, the Romans used this thing called a city register. And they would not have required every individual. They simply would have gone to each city and said, okay, we need the city register. And then from the city register, then they'll be able to determine, okay, well, there's this many people in the city, so that's how many people we have in this region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So it wasn't this highly individualized census. The Romans used a city model. So what that verse is actually telling us is that Joseph and Mary had determined to move to Bethlehem because they were going to register there.
And if they're going to move there, you would think that they surely knew people there. And in the traditional story, they're going there. She's very pregnant. She's going to have this baby anytime. And when they get to town, there's no place to stay. But correct us on what really happened.
Oh, sure. Of course. Now, there is the possibility. Now, this one, there's a lot of conjecture around this, but it's pretty difficult to, quote unquote, prove, but it is logical. Number one, there's the possibility that Joseph straight up already owned property there himself. That is very possible. And if not that, the likelihood that they knew people and had relatives there is extremely high. And then after that, even if they did not, this was a hospitality culture. Hotels and motels, they existed, but not the way we think they did. You didn't necessarily have a motel in every village. In 150 plus years of archaeological expeditions in and around Bethlehem, they've never found a commercial traveler's inn. Bethlehem was just straight up too small to require one. And it was a hospitality culture where if you were traveling to a town and you needed to spend the night, you would simply go into the town square, sit down, and then someone would approach you and say, hey, do you need a room for the night? And that's just scratching the surface.
Right. But I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this question. So when they get there, you're saying that Joseph either already had property, or he went to look, or they may have known people, or they went to look for some place that they could stay via this last method. But our Christmas story says that they were trying to find an inn and they ended up in the in the manger area with animals.
Right, exactly. So yeah, that's the next logical step to discuss this misconception. So regardless of whether Joseph owned property, that's option one. Option two is that they knew people, probably relatives, or option three is that they just went to the town square and said, I am Joseph and I'm of the house and lineage of David, and they would have immediately been invited into somebody's home. Each one of those options places them in a traditional Judean home, not in a motel. And that's where we uncover this misconception regarding the translation of the English word inn. Okay, we say inn, that's from the King James. But when you go into the Greek, it's the Greek word kataluma, and a kataluma is not a commercial traveler's inn. A commercial traveler's inn in Greek is a pandokion, and we find that word in other records in Scripture where it clearly is represented as a traveler's inn, but a kataluma is a guest room in a private home. Now, to be accurate here, it is the kind of guest room that potentially could be rented out on occasion, but it is nonetheless a guest room in a private home. And what Scripture is telling us is that there was no room in the kataluma, no room in the guest room. And then the next step in our understanding is understanding what Judean architecture would have looked like, because in a traditional Judean home, the household animals were exactly that. They were household animals. They were kept in the house. So a traditional Judean home was usually one large rectangular room, and then at one end of the rectangle is where you put the guest room, and then at the other end of the rectangle is where you dug down into the earth about 3 feet and created this lower area where you'd be able to lead the ox or the donkey or the sheep or the goats, the few that a family would keep for personal use. That's where they would stay at night. Now, during the day, they'd lead them out into the yard and tether them up or put them in a pen or something like that. But at night, they'd bring them into the house because that would keep them safe. It would also provide extra heat for the house in colder weather. And then this lowered area would create a ledge. And it was on the ledge was where they either placed or dug right into the earth is where they would dig the feeding trough, or they would place the feeding trough, which, by the way, was made out of stone, because once again, stone was the primary building material, not wood. So a manger was a stone feeding trough placed on this ledge, and axiomatically, that places the manger in the living room. Is really what it boils down to. So now that we have this picture, it really overturns this common misconception that he was born in a stable, that they were outcasts, and that it was this cold winter's night and stuff like that, where in reality they were in a traditional Judean home, and that being laid in the manger was actually extremely logical because there was someone already in the guest room. So Joseph and Mary didn't get the guest room, and therefore to make a makeshift bed out of this feeding trough made complete sense.
Well, Tim, my nativity scene that I had growing up depicts them in the manger barn area, and there's wise men, there's shepherds, and you're kind of taking the air out of my balloon there. So if they're in someone's house, what about the shepherds and wise men? When do they show up, and where do they show up?
Well, the shepherds, now this is a part of the story that doesn't really change very much, is the story with the shepherds, because we're told that they're nearby. They're not really all that far away. They receive this spectacular announcement from the angels that tell them that the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King of Israel, has been born. And they're given very explicit instructions to go into Bethlehem and find this child, which means, frankly, and it's a small village, which means really all they did was go door to door and knock on the door and say, hey, really sorry to interrupt, but are there any newborn babes here? And it really is just that simple with regard to the shepherds. But it's a very different story with regard to the Magi, because you and I have joked about this on many occasions. Yep. I loved our manger scene when I was a kid. I loved playing with the figurines. And you and I have this running gag about how, well, it's much more symmetrical to put the shepherds on one side and the wise men on the other, right?
Looks great on your yard.
There you go. Exactly. See, but once again, when you do the detailed research, what we discover is that the shepherds and the Magi were not there at the same time. We are told very explicitly that the shepherds found a baby lying in a manger, but that the Magi found a young child living in a house. Now, it very well may have been the same house, but those two records give us a clear distinction between the baby and the young child. So the Magi, once you do the math, you realize that the Magi arrived about 15 months after Jesus was born. He would have been a toddler.
Okay, well, that's completely different than what we all think. And so why did they show up when they showed up? Herod is a part of this as well. So we've got about 7 minutes before our next break. So I'm going to give you the floor to kind of explain where you think we need to go with these two portions of the story.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Magi for a second, because the Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great, and they make this spectacular announcement. They say, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, once again, we could spend an entire hour deciphering what it means, we have seen his star in the east. But in Mesopotamian astronomy, they paid extraordinary attention to what is known as the helical rising of planets. And if you go into, this is recorded in cuneiform clay tablets that are on display in the British Museum in London. And finally, after, years and years and years and years of research, we have finally begun to understand this a little bit, that they would literally track the helical rising of stars and planets very meticulously. And for the listeners, the helical rising of a planet, helios is the Greek word for sun. So a helical rising is when a planet pops up above the eastern horizon early in the morning, right before the sun comes up, and then obscures it from view because the sun's brightness means you can't see it anymore. And we now know from translating these cuneiform tablets recovered from Mesopotamia that the Magi tracked the helical risings of Venus and Jupiter. They actually tracked Jupiter super specifically. They tracked Jupiter on a daily basis. Every day they wrote down where Jupiter was in the sky. And so we know that this is what they would have looked for. And when they make that statement, we have seen his star in the east, in the Greek, that is better translated, we have seen his star in the rising. They were looking for the helical rising of what they understood to be his star, quote unquote. And if we're coming up on a break, I don't want to try to squeeze this into the break. Let's hit it after the break to explain what that is.
No, Tim, you've got probably 4 more minutes.
Okay, let's do it then. Okay, so here we go. So what they saw, let me just tell you what it is they saw. So we're talking about the planet Jupiter, okay? And the planet Jupiter is going to pop up above the horizon right before the sun blots it out and you can't see it. Okay. Now this happens. I don't have it memorized. I think the helical cycle of Jupiter is 434 days if I remember. So each year it moves about 1 month. So if the heliacal rising of Jupiter this year is in June, well, then next year it's in July, and then next year it's in August, and it moves about 1 month each year. So they would have known mathematically when this was going to occur, but they put a great significance on actually observing it. And then what we also know from ancient records about what ancient astronomers and astrologers were looking for, they would have looked for whether the planet was in the same sign as the sun or not. Okay. Now, if it's not in the same sign, so if, for example, Jupiter is in Virgo, but the sun is in Leo, then they did not consider that a significant omen. Mm-hmm. But if Jupiter was in Leo and the sun is in Leo, then that is a majorly significant omen. And this is important because it helps us decipher what year he was born in, because in the year he was born, Jupiter and the sun were in the same sign. And that would have been the constellation of Leo. And then combined with that is the fact that Jupiter would have been in conjunction with the star Regulus. So you would have had Jupiter and Regulus in conjunction in Leo during Jupiter's heliacal rising. So when you put all of that together, especially in the year that I believe it occurred, even though mathematically it could have occurred a couple of thousand years earlier, I believe this was an unprecedented observation of this sign that had never been observed before in human history.
And the Magi would have absolutely taken note of that. Tim, we got like 1 or 2 minutes in this segment. Just say something else quickly about the Magi. We think there was 3 of them. That's how they're depicted. And they show up. It wasn't quite like that.
No, not quite like that. They were they were ambassadors, like we said, and they gave this daily intelligence briefing to the king. And when they saw this sign, which we'll talk a little bit more about after the break, when they saw the sign, this was unprecedented. This was an unprecedented sign. So it motivated them to leave their empire and to travel into, quote unquote, enemy territory to go discover this king, this rightful king of the nation of Judea. So this is really a big deal. So it would have taken them a little while to get their preparations made, but as an official ambassadorial entourage, it wouldn't have been 3. It would have been at least 10 or 20, and possibly as high as 100 ambassadors with their servants, their families, their entourage, and then military escort.
A really significant movement of people.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's take a break right there. I'm speaking with Tim Kise. He is the creator of God Save the King, which is a research project about the historical accuracy of the nativity story. And he is telling us some of the things that have been misconceived over the years and telling us what really happened. We're going to take a break. This is TNT. My show is Deprogram. We'll be right back.
For the news and talk you can't hear anywhere else.
It gives you some awareness of what's really going on.
Where things are at, even around the world.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right. When we left, Tim was telling us that these Magi, these men of learned knowledge and esoteric knowledge, they were court appointees in many cases to help the royal families find their way. Anyway, they see this very significant sign in the sky. They are going to go follow that. There wasn't 3 of them. There were potentially hundreds, and they were surrounded by their camels, their animals, and I'm sure an intelligence or security group around them. So this is a big scene. And I'll let you take it from there because you wanted to return to what they saw in the sky.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to add one thing about this because this really is an unprecedented event, and part of the understanding lies in the Hebrew words for what they saw, okay? Because as I mentioned, what they would have seen would have been the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in the constellation of Leo. And by the way, this would have occurred on July 29th of 3 BC. And the reason we know it's not 4 BC or 2 BC is because in those years, Jupiter and the sun were not in the same sign. This year, they were in the same sign, okay? And the planet Jupiter in Hebrew is tzedek, okay? It means righteousness, okay? And Jupiter throughout classical antiquity was known as the king planet. So what you have right there is the king of righteousness is represented in Jupiter. And then you've got Regulus. Now, Regulus in Hebrew is the word melech, okay, which is simply the word for king, period. And throughout classical antiquity, Regulus was known as the king star. So now you have the king star and the king planet in conjunction in the royal sign of Judah. But when you take those two words and put them together as a compound word, you get Melchizedek. So that means you have Melchizedek rising in Judah is the meaning of that. And that would have been an unprecedented sign that they would have seen to see that there it is. It's right there in their face, that they go outside in the morning, early in the morning, they see the heliacal rising of Jupiter. It pops up possibly for only a few seconds before it is occluded by the sun. They take note, but to them, that means, like I said, Jupiter and Regulus rising in the constellation of Leo. Melchizedek is rising in Judah.
And that is the indication that the king has been born. So they are going to get their camels and their people and their crew, and they're going to go find this king. And they show up to see Herod, and he doesn't take it that well, or he's very concerned.
Absolutely. This is a part of the story that we blow right past, and it's in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 3. Verses 1 and 2 are the verses that tell us, in the days of Herod the king, wise men from the east, showed up in Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." And then in verse 3, it says, "And Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him." This created a great commotion, and it's because of the size of the entourage that showed up. It's not because there was 3 wise men on camels. It's because this was a small army that showed up to, frankly, install the legitimate king of the Jews, which Herod was not. And you just can't get past that.
And I listened, when you first told me this, I had no clue. And my gosh, we have a matter of like 9 minutes and there's so much to cover. But Herod, you mentioned he was not the rightful king. So they are coming to install what they believe is the rightful king. And so he knows what's up and is very concerned by this. So you tell me where we go next.
Well, to fill this out, we actually have to give you a little bit of the backstory of Herod himself, because at this point in the story, Herod is right around 70, 71, 72 years old. He is old. He is in very, very poor health. He is declining mentally as well as physically. Frankly, when the Magi arrive, based upon the timetable that I understand, he's within about 6 to 8 weeks of his death. And so you don't learn a whole lot about Herod from this couple of verses, right? You actually have to back up. And this is where you have to go into historical records to find out who Herod was. And the super fast summarized version is that Israel had been dominated by these foreign cultures for hundreds of years. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and now Rome. And they had this brief period of independence, like I said, from about the middle of the 2nd century to about the middle of the 1st century BC. They were an independent nation for about 100 years. And during that period of independence, they were ruled by a family known as the Maccabees and or the Hasmoneans, 2 different names for the same family. They started a rebellion against their Greek overlords. They declared their independence, and then they became the de facto, and that's the right word, they became the de facto royalty for about the next 100 years. But when you get to roughly 67, 65 BC, Israel has had a queen for about 10 years. Queen Salome Alexandra has reigned in Judea, and her 2 sons are going to go to war over the throne of Judea. The eldest son is kind of a passive kind of guy, but he's supposed to be the next ruler. It's the younger son who is more capable. And so the younger son attacks the older son and starts this big mess, which attracts the attention of the Romans. And of course, that means that the Romans come in and they pick one of the leaders, and it just becomes this giant mess. But mixed into all this is that the older son, whose name is Hyrcanus, he has a court official that works for him whose name is Antipater. And Antipater is an extremely wealthy, intelligent, resourceful, and conniving manipulator and ambitious. He is the perfect politician, and he is arranging for his family to have tremendous prosperity and success because he is manipulating Hyrcanus, and he is playing Game of Thrones with the Roman Empire, and he arranges for his 2 sons to become the governors of Jerusalem and Galilee. His son Faisal is the governor of Jerusalem, and then his son Herod is the governor of Galilee. And we've got this extraordinary mess of the maneuvering for the throne between these 2 brothers. So initially what happens is that ironically, the Romans pick the younger brother because he's more capable, but then he gets impatient and makes a big mistake. So the Romans switch their allegiance and say, no, we're going to pick the older brother, and which is really interesting because Antipater is his court official, right? So Antipater immediately goes to work, securing everything, and he thrives. But the younger son, because he was rejected by the Romans, he runs off to the Parthians and enlists their aid, and they come in, and in 40 BC, they invade Judea and drive out the Romans out of Judea. So this is where we get the title God Save the King. This is what all the research that I've done that gives us this story and this title is that the older son, Hyrcanus, and he goes to negotiate with the Parthians along with Faisal, who is the governor of Jerusalem. They get taken prisoner by the Parthians. Herod had wisely stayed in the rear in case everything goes sideways, which it did. So he immediately takes off for Petra in Nabatea to see if he can't get aid there. That doesn't work. And then he goes to Alexandria in Egypt to try to find the Roman general Marcus Antonius to get aid from him. He's not there, but he meets with Cleopatra. Cleopatra puts him on a ship for Rome, where he finally finds Marcus Antonius, who introduces him to Augustus. And he's not Augustus yet. He's still Octavian at this point, changes his name later. But they take him to the Roman Senate and present him as the perfect client king. And the Roman Senate appoints Herod as the king of Judea.
And he remains that for quite a long time. And actually, as a king, he's a great builder and a powerful king. So he has a long run.
Yes, he does. So the one little piece we got to put in here is that then he takes his private army, plus he gets loaned a couple of Roman legions to go retake Judea from the Parthians, which he does. It takes him 3 years for him to claim his throne. But that's the point here. He's had to fight the Parthians before. So when the Parthian Magi show up with a small army on his doorstep, telling him you're not the legitimate king, he's been in exactly the same position before, because he was appointed king by the Romans. He wasn't a legitimate king. He was appointed king, and he took it by force. And then he defended his throne for the next 35 years. And now at the very end of his life, the Magi show up, like we said, with an army saying, wait a second, where's the legitimate king?
And Tim, we've got like a minute and a half, unfortunately, because we have to tell people when you believe that Jesus was actually born. So however you want to fill this minute and a half, the floor is yours.
Okay, very good. Well, when he was born actually comes from a separate record that will surprise most people. We actually find the date of his birth given in the Bible in code. It's not explicit. It's not even implicit. It's given to us in code. It's in Revelation chapter 12 in verse 1, where we are told that John saw a sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And what he is seeing is a sign in the sky. He's seeing an astronomical sign, and it is the constellation Virgo in combination with the constellation Leo. And when the setting sun is in the middle of her body, the moon
Tim, that's the
is
music.
under
When
her
was
feet.
he born? I'm sorry.
He was
That's the
born
music.
September 11th. I get it. He was born September 11th, 3 BC.
9/11, 3 BC is when Jesus Christ was born. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tim Kise. Please go visit his site, GodSaveTheKing.org. You can also hear him weekly on Truth Be Told Radio Network. I wish we could have gone longer. Tim, I'll be having you back. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. My name is Michael Parker. This is TNT Radio. My show is Deprogram. We'll be back tomorrow.